morning, everyone, and welcome to the CBI at 10. It's great to have you here. There is a good deal to talk about. This morning, we're going to focus on remote working. We've given ourselves the title, How to Ensure Your Team Thrives in a Remote Environment. We're lucky to have Emma Stewart, the CEO of TimeWise, and Colin Barnes, the director at Aon here. We were saying just before the call started that the truth of remote working is that there are two camps. One is the please let it end, I just want to get back to work camp, and there's the other, which is this is the way of the future. Let's imagine a better way of working into the 2020s. We'll discover, not least from Emma and Colin, which view or feeling prevails. But as you know, with these calls, the really valuable thing is actually hearing from all of you. So please do weigh in with either comments on what's massively frustrating or suggestions on what's, constructively what's really working. I'll weave that into the conversation with Emma and Colin. But I'm going to kick off with Matthew Fell, the CBI's policy director. I also said to Matthew that everything lands in his lap, because Matthew is that point person, the one behind the scenes in the CBI, whose job is to try to coordinate these discussions with all different parts of government. And given that government these days, Matthew, can't entirely make all the conversations between itself work, I imagine that it's a complicated time. Do you want to start, if you would, Matthew, by just giving us a sense of how business is dealing with the arguments over local lockdown and tiering?
Yeah, well, thanks, James, and good morning, everyone. James, I think you're completely right. A lot of the action last week was focused around local lockdowns. Clearly, we had the introduction of this new tiered approach, tier 1, 2, and 3. Tier 1 being essentially the sort of national base case where we've got things like the rule of 6, 10 p.m. curfews and so on. It ratchets up for tier 2, particularly that restriction about not mixing with other households indoors. And then tier 3, the most severe set of restrictions, closure of pubs, bars, gyms and so on, layered on top of that. And I think a few reflections from business. Firstly, the real importance of compliance and clarity. And I think really what helps that is an encouragement wherever possible to show the evidence base and almost the sort of workings in the margins. That's how I think you get buy-in, not just from business, but from individuals. If they can see how a particular restriction actually changes the dial in terms of infection rates and so on. That's so important, I think, for bringing people with you, and where we want to put a spotlight on things like the 10 p.m. curfew to say, does that really make a difference or not? There's also, I think, clarity that comes in, and this is really important for helping businesses to plan. And I'm thinking there particularly about the trigger thresholds. How do you move from one set of restrictions to another? And also, I was speaking to a number of our colleagues in CBI regions last week who said actually they've also still got some legacy restrictions in place from hangover from a previous setup. And it's really quite complex then to understand what's one set of rules and restrictions in one area compared to another. So I think actually the push from businesses for simplicity across those three tiers, that we think will help drive compliance. And then the bit that we've really been working on is making sure that the financial and business support that goes hand in glove with those restrictions absolutely acts in lockstep with those. And I think, there is obviously additional support for those businesses that are told to close in no uncertain terms. And actually, in a sense, you can argue about the level of generosity for those, but there is some thinking going on for those businesses. But the more you get into it, I think there are a number of different buckets then of businesses that are affected, even if they're not told to close and can stay open. So you think about companies who are in a tier 3 region, for example. There are many that supply into those businesses that are told to close, for example, food distribution and so on. They remain open, but their business is severely impacted. Also in tier 3, there are plenty of businesses where, again, they're open, but demand has significantly fallen off because everybody is just being very, very cautious and they're not out and about in the same way. And even in those tier 2 businesses, they're either fearing that there's more restrictions on the way, so again, I'm treading cautiously, or because you can't mix households indoors. If I'm in leisure and hospitality, again, I've seen business fall away even when I'm still technically open. we've been doing a lot of thinking, James, around what is the right answer on this. And for us, I think it's a combination of two things. One, it feels further funding channeled through local authorities so that they can get grant support to the businesses and so on. There's an idea that the local authorities know the situation best on the ground, so they're able to tailor and direct that to where need is at its greatest. And then the other piece feels like we do need to have another look at the new job support scheme and think about what is the right balance between the funding and the contribution that businesses make relative to the government make. And perhaps the tighter the restrictions are, we need to have a little bit of a play and change that balance to keep as many jobs and businesses going as we possibly can.
Matthew, I was really interesting and obviously very important to a lot of companies who are in October thinking to themselves, what now for the remaining months of the year and into 2021. So can we just go through some of those things, if you like, in reverse order? When you think now about what the CBI might discuss with Treasury and Bays on, if you like, JSS 2.0, is that a different level of financial commitment from companies? And if so, what do you think would be reasonable?
Yeah, we've not yet, James, worked through the exact amount that is. There are some, I think the principles of the JSS are really important. The idea that you have to be working for a particular period of time, we want to hold on to those because that gives a sense that there is a strong and healthy underlying business there. But I think at the moment when, in a sense, the parameters of that scheme were designed for a scenario where we were gradually beginning to open up the economy, that has now flipped on its head, and many actually are sort of for a smaller period of time going into a more restricted setup again. It's just that balance of the payments that we think. So the employer contribution as opposed to what the government tops up, that probably just needs to move in kilter with that, we think.
Okay, well, I know that companies on the call will have views about what they think is affordable and how that JSS can work. Can I just touch on another element of it, which is some people, lots of companies have said, and I suppose you touched on this in the way in which you describe demand in tier 2 and tier 3 environments, is that a lot of companies can't keep people employed because the demand has disappeared through no fault of their own. What's your thinking about support for them, companies that seem ineligible but are drastically affected?
Well, I think, James, that is, a couple of thoughts on that. One is, I mentioned targeted grant support feels like it's the other big lever that could be pulled in relatively short order. I think sort of speed and simplicity are here, and of course, making sure that support gets to the people who need it most. And that's where our thinking is that actually it's the local authority level that are most in tune with the situation on the ground, because it will be different. It's quite hard to design something that has complete national reach. We know there are nuances even within different sectors. There are parts of hospitality who've actually been doing reasonably well through this part, as well as many parts, particularly in city centres, that are really struggling and are very hard hit. So you need to be quite nuanced and targeted in your design about that. And then, James, the other bit that I've not mentioned yet, but clearly helps those kind of businesses the most, is trying to find a way to get them reopened as rapidly as we possibly can. And that is the role that testing plays in this whole debate. We have some encouragement, I think, from the Prime Minister, and that confirms what we've been talking about with officials on Friday, that they are starting to think about getting production capacity really ramped up for more rapid mass testing, the sort of 15-minute swab tests and things like that. If we could get that in much wider circulation in relatively short order, so within the next month or two, we think there are a number of use cases then that it starts to make the economy both more resilient for those companies, the manufacturers, the factories, the production lines that are already open. It makes them much more resilient and keeps as many people in work as possible. And also, if we can move beyond that, it starts to make other parts of the economy, such as international travel, events, and so on, they can start to see light at the end of the tunnel and think about a way back to ramp up their businesses again. And that, coupled with the targeted support, is probably the best combination of things we think that can help see firms through.
Well, to that point, Matthew, I just want to reflect back to you that One person on the call just wrote in to say, so this is just about the demand point. I think it's really useful that this is kind of widely circulated. In tier 3, you can't travel in and out for leisure. While some businesses won't be instructed to close, the travel ban essentially kills demand. They need to be covered by job support. So just a sort of more power to your elbow on that.
Completely.
I'm going to, Matthew, I'm going to come back, if I might, towards the end to the point you make about data and the 10 p.m. curfew and some of the communications issues here on clarity. But actually, I'd love to get into the real conversation of today, remote working, how we make it work. And Emma, I'm going to come to you first, if I might. I was on a call before this one early this morning, so it was some sort of whiz on robotics, and I said, how are you feeling about all of this? And he just went, ah. There's no words. So tell us how we get ourselves excited and energized again by making teams work in a remote environment.
Thanks, James. So what I would say is, I think it is less about the tech now, and it's more about culture and behaviours and how we really understand how we design work. So I mean, at TimeWise, we've been advising businesses for about 15 years on flexible working, and I think what we've seen before and what we're certainly seeing now in terms of what works is it's basic principles. The first is it's about having good leadership, so ensuring that organisations are really clear and articulate how they want people to work, that leaders walk the talk. And we've all had those conversations and seen people with their cats and their kids on their laps, but it's more than that. It's about making sure that you look after your people in terms of modelling boundaries, modelling behaviours, etc. as a leader. Second thing I would say is it's around how our managers are equipped to manage dispersed teams. So organisations that have been good at this for a long time and are increasingly resilient now have trained their managers in how to do job design, have trained them in how to manage people they can't see, because that's not something we've historically ever done in this country. We have all kinds of other kind of L&D and leadership and management training, but understanding the tasks and the outputs you should expect from people within very different times, locations and ways of working is going to be really critical to then be able to manage performance expectations. And I would say that's critical when it comes to looking at different demographics. If you have, as we all do, workforces that comprise people with caring responsibilities, we've got women who are having to juggle all kinds of other things, being clear that you understand what to expect from people and that remote working doesn't equate to all kinds of flexible working. So managing part-time, managing start and finish times. And that leads me on to my third point, which is it's also about recognising and being really transparent that you can have fair processes, but you may not necessarily have fair parity when it comes to the kind of flexibility that people need. So, we're talking about remote working here, but we have over 7 million frontline workers in this country who can't take the laptop and sit at home. Yeah. They're on wards, they're on construction sites, they're in schools. So, but also within very big firms, you have people who have different tasks. So it's about recognising that and being really transparent that you can, and we all need to flex, but that it's going to work for different people in different ways.
So, Emma, just going through some of those things. Firstly, I'm really interested about what you say about boundaries, right? So what do you advise to people about what boundaries they set and how they set them?
So there's a sort of sweet spot between what the organisation needs and what individuals need. I mean, there's micro things and there's big things. So we were just talking on before on the call about the fact that, we're all getting into this culture of Zoom, literally one after another. Simple things that you can do is say, we'll allow 10 minutes to settle into a Zoom call. So it'll be 50 minutes, not an hour long. So you can give people some space to go and make a cup of tea, to go and get a breath of fresh air, to actually also have some informal conversations on those Zoom calls. So that point in the meeting where there's 3 of you sitting there as opposed to 10, and you ask how the kids are doing. Those are the kind of things that people really need in work. But in terms of kind of the broader piece, it's just in boundaries, we are enabling people to work around everything that's happening in their lives. We're also at risk of this digital presenteeism, which is, people get up and they sit at the computer and they work all day. You need to give people space. They may need to work in the morning at the end of the day if they've got something caring issues in the middle, but make sure they take a break. So it's about really being clear, because ultimately all the evidence shows that if you give people control over how they work, if you give people work-life balance, then performance and productivity does go up. So and that's got to be a two-way dialogue constantly, you know, and it's about having pulse surveys, but really listening to your teams and devolving issues to teams, because they will work it out, because everyone is dependent on everybody else. So it's complex, but teams often have the best solutions.
And Emma, what I'm going to come to Colin in a moment, but I'm interested also in this idea of having your management properly equipped, right? I mean, I'm a journalist. I come from a journalistic background. That's not something we do anyway in the best of circumstances. Working out how you do it digitally is really tough. So, what are you talking about in terms of management skills for remote working?
So again, there's softer skills and then there's more technical skills. So on the soft side, a lot of it is around just really good communication, and making sure that managers are able to lean in and be really proactive in having conversations around how people are working, not just the outputs and the expectation, which any good manager should do. It's about the trust piece, which, you know, we always say if you don't trust someone, they shouldn't be working for you. It's not a reason not to do flexible working. Yeah. It's helping managers to build those soft skills to ensure that they can do this. I mean, we did a piece of research with the CMI last year that showed that only 1 in 5 managers had ever proactively asked an individual at a performance review how was the way they were working for them. So how was their flexible working? So, you know, so we've got to do that now. We've got to be proactive. So there's that, and then there's also the hard piece around actually understanding how jobs are designed. So we don't teach job design. I mean, at Timewise we do a lot of training around job design, but if you're going to manage 50 people, you know, you're going to manage a bunch of people who are going to manage 50 people, knowing what you expect in 5 days, in 4 days, in 3 days. You know, we don't redesign jobs when we let people go part-time. We just sort of assume that the 2 days a week will float away somewhere and it'll get picked up. But we have to really understand how we design jobs and how we design task and function and time to get the best people. And we're at risk sometimes of skewing that.
Completely, and also, of course, we design jobs for a different way of working, and now we're relearning that. Emma, I'm going to come back to you as you were talking. There's a fantastic waterfall of questions. Some of them about chairs, some about culture, some of them about meeting times. We're going to get into all of that, but I want to bring in Colin first, if I might. Colin, you're director at Aon. Funny enough, I can see where you work, but obviously that's not where you're working. And so tell us a little bit about what you're doing. And can you talk a little bit about this London Work Travel Convene coalition, which I think is, you were saying just before we started, is thinking about how we think about offices and cities, or workplaces and cities.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to follow up, I thought the points that Emma made were fantastic, and my additions to those would be, I think the word that will come up a lot as we go through the conversation is trust. And we talk about how an employer has to trust their employees. And I think the other thing that I would just add to that initial opening was around being results orientated. So we talked about presenteeism and digital presenteeism. If people can have a results orientated focus, then that's a really good output for the end of the day. If they can look back and say, I've achieved. I think that's important. You opened actually, James, by talking, the analogy you gave was, do people just want this thing to go away, or are they starting to turn to the future? Yeah. And the London the Work Travel Convene initiative that we've launched, it's global. We've launched it across 8 major cities. So we're in London, New York, Chicago, Dublin, Singapore, Tokyo, and Madrid. And from a London perspective, we brought together a coalition of city and Canary Wharf-based employers to try and do a variety of things. We're trying to do a bit like some of the things we're doing on this call. We're giving them the opportunity to discuss challenges, share ideas, and think about what the future looks like. We're giving them the opportunity to hear from the city ecosystems, so they can hear from the Transport for London, they can hear from clinicians, they can hear about vaccines, they can hear about testing, they can hear from futurologists about what we think the data might be telling people for the future. So there's some of the things that expert people will come along and talk to the coalition about. And where the coalition is global, we're also asking every employer that takes part to go through a readiness assessment form, a series of questions, and it's quite in depth. It's 18 topics and 180 questions. What that will give us is a global body set of data across a whole load of different things that we'll be able to analyse, that hopefully then For members of the coalition, we can give back to them and say, this is what's going on for you, and these are points where you can live and learn and think for the future. But we hope we can also use the aggregated data to give to government and other bodies to say, these are the things that are going on, these are the things that are working, and these may be the areas for the future that you need to focus on. So it's quite a broad set of work.
It's really interesting. Is the thinking, Colin, that what you're preparing for is not just the next 6 months, but is a structural change in the way in which cities work, or is it a short-term plan to get from here to the summer?
It's both. So initially, when we first convened, we were thinking we were starting to ease down a little bit. The coalition meeting we had only 2 weeks ago, it was before the second announcement for the further restrictions. Employers on those calls were starting to talk about people being back in the office. They were talking about 40–50% occupancies in their buildings. The coalition meeting happened the day before, and it just cleared it all out, and it was saying that the whole meeting was basically underpinned by, it almost feels like a collective, we've got 6 more months again, and now we do need to think about the future. We know this isn't going away. It's not going away. We know we need to think about long-term change in working environment. So practical things like, how can Transport for London get people into the buildings safely, to longer term plans around, what do the buildings look like, and do you need people in the buildings, and what does real estate look like, what do leaders need to do to enforce those messages, how do you communicate, how do we create resilience that Emma's touched upon already, all of those themes, health and well-being, mental health in a long-term sustained pandemic, how do we build for that future, and what does it look like, and how can we learn from each other? I think the biggest thing we're trying to, or one of the biggest things that we're trying to make the coalition do, is help employers answer questions they can't answer themselves, that the collective of them working through some of these things together gives them the right output, gives them an answer. There's a lot of things employers can do themselves. They can go off and do things perfectly adequately on themselves, but we think it's helpful to share ideas with other similar organisations and try and plan for the future that way, which is hopefully what this initiative will create.
Can we, Colin? Can we? I'd love to just spend a few minutes talking actually between the four of us, but to bring Emma and Matthew as well. There's a lot of focus at the moment, Colin, on, understandably, on concerns about youth unemployment, what happens in the economy and the impact on young people. I think all of us who work in places are also actually worried about youth employment, young people who are in work. You know, I'm struck by the fact all four of us are on a call. We're all in rooms with no one else in the room, as far as I can see. That's not a position that everyone else has, right? Especially if you're a young person, you're in a flat, you've got this, you know, we all know people are really struggling with that. There were two questions that really struck me from the start. One is about chairs, right? Are companies, a company like Aon, saying, okay, you can take your office chair home, you know, how do you get yourself comfortably set up? And then another question was about culture, which is how do you, you know, I know that when I learned what I learned in a newsroom, a lot of it was just, you know, not by teaching, but by proximity. I just witnessed what other people did. And so I'm going to come to you first, Colin, then you, Emma, and then you, Matthew, just on that about young people in employment. How do you make the youngest people feel as though team working remotely is really working for them?
Yeah, and we were talking before the call as well. I still think that is one of the biggest challenges that exists. It's really hard. It's really hard to embed a culture into a person, to train them, to get some of those soft skills across to them in a remote environment. It's not an easy thing to do, and I don't think, I stand to be corrected, but I'm not sure anybody's really cracked that yet. I don't think there's a silver bullet for it. In terms of,
and what do you mean, Colin, about the physical support for young people?
Yeah, well, what we've seen organisations do is some buildings can be open for certain numbers of people, so you can still go into them. So what we've seen organisations do is use the space that they've got for those that probably need it the most. So if your occupancy can only be a certain percentage, then you go through and you determine who are the people that might benefit the most from the occupancy. And that can be people that don't have the right working environment. It can be people that suffer from being on their own all day and all night, or have mental health challenges. So we've seen organisations, and we've done it ourselves as an organisation, is prioritise, try and make a bit of a pyramid for those people that will benefit from the most about still going into a building and the space that is available, letting them use it first. And that does answer some of those challenges. It doesn't answer them completely, but it does take a step forward.
Emma, I'm going to come to you. I just want to flag something to you, Colin, from Ruth Gawthorpe, who's just made a point, just because it's connected to the Work Travel Convene coalition. She writes, the decline of office space will affect small, medium and large cities differently. The experience of going to the office in, say, Winchester, Hereford, Bangor, or here in Truro isn't the same as going to the office in London or Birmingham. And I don't think this is on the government's radar. Some of the smaller cities are benefiting, and certainly the smart towns and villages in Cornwall are booming. Co-working where people can walk or cycle is growing here. I just think it's a really important point, and it's one of those ones I'm sure we'll come to. But Emma, can we just go back to what we were discussing, young people at work?
Yeah, I agree with Colin. I think it's really hard, and I think it's the area we haven't really cracked yet. What I would say is, I think one of the things we're all having to do is communicate far more. And some of the risks that we face, anybody faces coming into an organisation fresh, young people in particular, but any other demographic groups, is the informal and the sort of the sense that you are excluded because you don't know what the rules are. And you don't know how things work. We're having to communicate everything a lot more formally. So one of the things that we're seeing is there's some good mentoring going on. There are some good ways of enabling people to understand the things that you do that don't get talked about. So email etiquette. So, you know, yes, we start at 9, but actually most people tend to start at 8:30 in the morning. We're having to formalise that, and that in some respects I think is going to be a good thing as we come out of this, because if we want more inclusive workplaces, we need to articulate this stuff. You know, people have benefits when they've been in organisations for a long time and they know what all those informal rules are. So let's share them and try and sometimes challenge them as well. You know, sometimes when you formulate and document these things, you realise that, hang on a minute, everybody is starting at 8:30. We should start at 9. Why are we starting at 8:30? But also giving people buddies. And I think the other thing is spatially, and again, it's a really interesting point about smaller cities. I mean, we've seen over the weekend the research showing that actually retail is benefiting in some of these smaller towns. But if you're in a bigger area, looking at how we can create sort of smaller hubs where actually, you know, you have teams of people or people onboarding, and they might be able to meet somebody in a hot desking environment, not in HQ, but somewhere on the edge. So I think, you know, there are all kinds of creative things that are happening, but we're learning from each other, and it's going to take time to bed down. And I think my last point, there are risks for lots of groups as well. Young people have particular risks. We're seeing a lot of risks for older workers as well. We're seeing a lot of risks for women at the moment. 2 in 5 women have said that they are considering leaving work because jobs aren't being redesigned to enable to balance everything. So they are huge, but all the risks differ depending on different demographics.
And Emma, can I just ask you to just to follow up on a couple of questions that people ask specifically? Right. So you talk about buddying and mentoring. There's a really there's a sort of direct and practical question, which is about how many times people should meet. You should have a whole team meeting. So this is Lauren Dorney asks this question because she's in a team of 10. She says managers are talking to staff daily for all different reasons, as well as other colleagues. But what about the whole team to be together? There's only 10 of us. So can you ask how many times a week would be suggested suitable for a whole team meeting? And Natalie King asks, I think, sort of a related question on our subject. I'm concerned that people at the early stage of their careers are missing opportunities to learn about workplace culture, ways of working, and exposure to more senior colleagues. Right? What can we do to tackle this? So I'm really interested in, if you create a buddy system or a mentoring system, are you talking to that person every other day, once a week, every fortnight? I mean, practically speaking, how do you do it?
I'm going to give an awful answer. It depends on the nature of the role and depends on the nature of the team. So on how often, I mean, if you're a small team, we often advise once a week, but I would always ask, how often were you meeting before? And what additionality do you need now in terms of communication? So start where you were and then build off on that. And also try once a week. If it feels too much and you run out of things to say, do a half-hour meeting, don't do an hour meeting, or do a meeting fortnightly. So I think teams are going to have to just trial things. There is no right answer to this, is the best thing I can say. In terms of mentoring, again, it depends on the nature of the mentee and mentorship. All of these things depend on the interdependency of how work gets done. But I would say try it. Just try doing a mentoring arrangement on maybe a weekly basis. You do more at the beginning and then you ease off. And again, the nature of that relationship will be based on feedback between the two. So if your mentee is benefiting, but they're like, hang on, I've got to just do my day job, then you can do it in a more agile way. And sometimes it's less about a formal arrangement. It's just about dropping somebody a note on some sort of online chat to say, can I just ask you this question? So we're learning to be more agile as a point, and actually we need to embrace that agility, because that will help us all to perform better. What we don't want is to fill our diaries with meetings where we're not quite sure why we're needing these meetings, and we can communicate in a more fluid way some other way.
Matthew, can I just ask you just a couple of things on this? One is just to pick up on Emma's point about the creeping discrimination of remote working, who it hits and who gets affected, and also a little bit about the mental health issues and how business engages on the mental health front. It's really striking that someone called Claire Douglas has written and just said, I work in construction. The people we find are struggling more are not the site guys who work from work is pretty much normal, but the people having to work from home and lacking social contact.
James, I think that's completely right. I mean, both that question and Emma touched on it. I think one of the things that we're hearing through in the last month or so more is the sort of the have and the have not culture, those who can work a bit more flexibly and remotely and those that can't. And as Emma talked about, getting that balance right for those organisations who've got different setups going on for different parts of their workforce, but making sure everyone feels involved and engaged in the sort of design and the rationale of that, even if then clearly the outcomes might be different for certain individuals. I think that process and engagement through all that is super important. I think then the mental health piece, James, you talked earlier on about, in a sense, if the first 6 months of this crisis, everyone was sort of, we're doing it on a make do and mend basis and we're sort of just going to make it through to the other end sort of thing. That I think really has changed, both with the announcement from the Prime Minister that the sort of work from home wherever possible directive, if you like, is going to go for another 5 or 6 months. That I think really changed mindsets and changed expectations. And as well, I think you talk to lots of companies about what is really going to change and sort of stick and endure as a result of this crisis. And the flexible working and the sort of office and commercial premises space, those seem to be top of the list in terms of what is going to change for the long term. And I think that's what's changed approaches on this. So mental health, if again, the first part of this crisis was as much thinking about people's physical health, and business stepped up and played its part in that with sort of PPE and ventilated challenges and things like that. I think that probably one of the most critical roles for business through this will be on the mental health and well-being side of things. There's plenty of things Emma and Colin have talked about, training for managers so that you can be in tune with and identify issues as much as it's possible remotely. But for me, it's also about making sure you build in time for conversations in a sense. The temptation in this kind of environment when you're chatting to people, and I can fall into this trap as well, is you just sort of crunch through a to-do list about what tasks are on, and you have a very transactional conversation with people and then move on. So building in time for development, how people are feeling, how is work going for them and so on. I think that is really important. And then also adjusting for this sort of long run experience, whether it is equipment more than just grabbing a laptop and away you go, but making sure people have got a decent, good setup at home and they have the right equipment and so on. And also the culture, making sure that the longer we're all further apart, probably increasing the visibility, the frequency of leadership in those areas, really important. We had a few questions in about what's the right level of frequency and what's the right level of duration. I think our experience, both from a CBI perspective and talking to businesses around the country, is sort of more is better. So you're more like, you do more than you would in normal times when you're remotely, even things like weekly all staff meetings. And particularly, I think those young people coming into the workforce, not just the onboarding, but the integration into teams as well, making sure they're properly paired up, not just with buddies so they can learn from others, but also amongst themselves as well, so that when they've got cohorts of new people coming into an organization, by 3-6 months, you probably be friends with people as well as colleagues and things like that. So how do you recreate that in an online world? Thinking through all those issues feels really, really important to us.
There's a really, as you were talking, Matthew. Adrian Went made a point about different ways of setting up meetings, and I really like this. I mean, it's a suggestion, it won't work for everyone, but what he writes is, working remotely, we have adopted a different meeting protocol, more regular meetings, i.e. daily, but only one subject per meeting. So it keeps them regular, it keeps up contact, but it means the meeting is short and to the point, which I rather like. He also says, I've got to just say, kind of probably a little less, more worryingly, he says that they're a manufacturing business, and there was already an us and them culture between office and workshop staff, and that's actually been exacerbated by this. And I suppose I wanted to touch on this, Emma and Colin, if I might. So, I was really struck a few weeks ago. Reed Hastings, the boss of Netflix, came out and said there's nothing good about remote working, right? And there was something sort of wonderful about that, because we'd all been energized by a new way of working, or many of us had been, and now there was a counterpoint to that. But it did strike me that there are certain kinds of work that must be much more difficult to do remotely. I mean, some obviously impossible, but some kind of teamwork or some kinds of collaborative work that must be much harder. And I just wondered, Emma, in your experience, you said time-wise you've had more than a decade of experience of this, you know, of making flexible working work. What's not our fault, if you like? What's the kinds of work that are just really hard to do?
So there are two types. So I think let's not forget that there are, as you say, millions of people who just can't work remotely. I think it's really important to make a distinction between remote working and all types of flexible working. So, you know, nurses, care workers, all the people actually that we really, really need to care about right now can't always benefit. So it's really important that we recognise that, and particularly in the context of your earlier remarks, I think, around wage subsidies and some of the risks, I would say, in terms of reduced hours working. You know, lots of people need reduced hours working in those industries, and unfortunately some of the government policies, I think, are going to disadvantage them as opposed to advantage them, because the compromise is often that you take a lower paid job in order to work part-time, and that should not be the case. So there's a whole agenda there. But in terms of the kind of work in a hybrid working environment that can and can't be done remotely, I think we've got to be really clear of the distinction between how we interact and communicate and whether we need to do that face-to-face or not, because there are some tasks that do need team-based, creative, knowledge interacting, problem-solving activity, and that's really, really important that we do as teams. It's better, and the evidence suggests, if you can do it face-to-face, you can engage more effectively, but we can find ways of doing that remotely, and we need to. And there's all sorts of amazing technology out there. You know, you can do sticky whiteboards on Zoom screens, etc., etc. I hate them myself, I have to say, but there are all kinds of ways that we can enable problem solving, knowledge sharing, creative work remotely. Also deep thought. I mean, as a journalist, you'll know, you know, sometimes you just need to be able to think quietly and work quietly. So fundamentally what we need to be asking ourselves is, you know, when we come out of this, I hope we ask ourselves, when do I need to be in an office environment in order to do the task of my job? When do I need to be at home? Where do I need to operate everything that I need to do? And how much work does this task take me? And if we can start to really sort of diagnose our own activities and do it in teams as well, I think we'll find ourselves probably far more productive. What we can't do and we shouldn't do is, we would sort of edging into it, I think, before this recent phase, is to say let's replace an old rule with a new rule, which is we're going to be in the office 2 days a week and 3 days from home, or 3 days in the office and 2 days from home, because that doesn't get under the skin of what the task and the job, and that's what you really need to do.
We've made that mistake, and I had to backpedal from that too. Just before I go to Colin, Emma, one thing. Gary Mumford, firstly, he suggests something interesting. He suggests, to your point about open conversations, that he says they have a 15-minute meeting every day with no agenda, right, where they just get a chance to check in with each other. I rather like, but also says that you mentioned a number of times training for managers to manage remotely. Where can they find that kind of training? I don't know whether TimeWise does it or someone that you know does it.
They can come and talk to us. We do. It's not just remote working, it's how to understand job design. So we do that training. I'll say this: there's not that many organisations that do. More and more are, but it's not been a thing. But we do it. So come and talk to us.
Okay, thanks, Emma. Colin, but you know, Aon, heaven knows, is a complicated business. Presumably you have some teams that are finding this remote working really working and some finding it really hard.
Yeah.
Will you tell us a little bit about the difference?
Yeah, and it's interesting, just on the prior point on the Netflix observation, we've seen quite a lot of, and we've helped employers with some of these pulse surveys and the different questionnaires that have gone out. We're starting to see the themes come back of the results now. And one of the questions, and there's a variance of the question, is would you like to go back to the way things were before the pandemic in terms of your traditional hours of being in the office? Would you like to be on the tube doing the commute? Would you go back to that? And I was just looking at the stats actually. So the lowest score I've seen for people saying, no, I wouldn't like to do it, is 80%, and the highest is 96%. So it's interesting that people are saying that there is something about this that they are taking as a positive, that they wouldn't like to go back to that traditional in the office 9 to 5 way of working. And again, we were talking before the call started about winter's coming, it's getting dark, we've touched on mental health. The ability, if you've got a flexible employer that trusts you and says you do the job the best you do at the time you need to do it, you can get out in the day and see some sunlight. In the old world, I would have been on a train in the dark, coming home in the dark and seen no daylight at all, whereas now I can buy a window with some daylight and I'll be able to get out in it. So it isn't a nice situation we're in at all, but there are some things that have come, I think, that have come out of it that will stick for the future. And that I definitely see as being one, that employees, are saying, there's bits of this that I like. People want to go into the office for collaboration. They want to be together for certain things. They don't want to be together for typing emails and doing day-to-day stuff that they can do anywhere on their own necessarily. I think they want to be together for social, for collaboration, for creativity. And I think that's what office space will start to be used more and more for as the thing changes.
Well, by the way, I really like that, not least because we do a lot of these calls, these CBI at 10, and rarely do we answer the exam question, you know, is it please can it let it end, or is it the way of the future? And you've rather brilliantly, both of you and Emma, have rather brilliantly said it's the way of the future. So we've actually answered our own question, a happy rarity. But Matthew, before we finish, can I just ask you just to come back on two things? You talked, you know, Colin just provided some data on ways of working. The 10 p.m. curfew issue and closures, I suppose what you're saying, if I read it right, is that businesses are getting frustrated because they don't feel as though they've got access to the data. And if that's the case, what can you do to help with that?
Yeah, I think that is it, James. I think the more we can see the sharing of that thinking. So does it really impact on the rate of infections or not? If you think about it from a business perspective, unless you share those workings in the margins, the sense of businesses is actually it creates bottlenecks. So I should more people in at a sort of shorter period of time. People then leave my premises and either the activity relocates to a less COVID secure environment, or I push a load of people onto public transport all at the same time and they're then crowded together again. So that is, I think, in that particular instance, how many businesses are thinking about it. If there is better data, or actually if they've missed the point and there's a way of saying to them, actually, these are the benefits that it has, this is why it's worth buying into as a measure, then I think more people can get on board with that. So I think the message from business to government is firstly to say, can you share all of those insights and put as much in the public domain and be as transparent about as possible? And then the other thing, again, that we saw played out last week, I think, is the sense of unity and collaboration. Let's bring as many people into the decision-making process as possible, both national government, local government, business leaders, etc. Again, so that everybody can understand the situation and agree on common course of action. And that's how I think you hold people together in a sense of unity.
And Matthew, I know we've talked about this before on a couple of other calls, advance warning. We talk about clarity in communications, but actually giving people a heads up of what's coming. Is there a sense that that's improving? I
think it is, James, but the bit I would say there is actually understanding the trigger points is probably the most bit. So I think there's an understanding of the business community. If you get fresh information, you've got to act quick on it, to be honest. Otherwise, you know, you're not really getting onto the source of the problem. But if people know what are the indicators and what are the trigger points that I'm really watching, so it's not just the absolute rates of infection, but the rates of increases and so on. If I can see that dashboard and really understand it, that means that I can equip myself and know what might be coming.
Brilliant. Well, listen, Matthew Fell, Policy Director of the CBI, thank you as ever. Colin Barnes from Aon and Em Stewart from Timewise. It's actually been absolutely fascinating. As you could tell, we could have gone on lots and lots of questions about this. I think we're going to be thinking about it well into the future. Join us again on Wednesday. CBI at 10 is back then. But for now, thank you both for joining us. Thanks, Matthew, as ever. Have a good day, everyone.